Today is March 11th, 2021. Exactly a year ago, on March 11th, 2020, that is the day when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, which means that this disease has been a pandemic for exactly a year now. That honestly feels very weird to me, the fact that this disease has been a pandemic for a year now. March of 2020 is when the lockdowns began. That's when social distancing measures started being put into place. That's when people started wearing masks. March of last year is when everything completely changed. That's when the world was completely altered because of this disease, COVID 19. So that's why to me it feels really weird, the fact that we're now back at March once again, but this time it's March 2021. We've basically come full circle. The second week of March is when everything started changing. That's when COVID 19 started to become a serious threat in many countries across the planet, especially in the United States, and that's also the week when it was declared a pandemic. That's when people started becoming a lot more aware of the virus. The thing about March 2020 is that at the start of the month, people barely thought about the virus. It wasn't really on the minds of most people, and people's lives weren't really affected by the virus for the most part. But by the end of March 2020, this virus had completely changed the lives of most people. As a result of this virus, everybody started wearing masks whenever they went out, and as a result of the virus, people only went out when necessary, at least for a while. I guess as time went on, people started going out more and more, but because of this virus, stay-at-home orders were implemented, mask mandates were implemented, social distancing measures were implemented, all sorts of things had to take place because of this virus. Many events got cancelled, especially if they were large gatherings. So it's been a year since that all began. That's why it feels really weird to me, the fact that we've now been in this pandemic for an entire year. We've lived an entire year in altered circumstances due to this virus. We've lived a year through this pandemic where we've had to wear masks. But there is good news though. The good news is that things appear to be getting a lot better, not only in the United States but also across the planet. There are now several vaccines that have been created. There's the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Those are the three vaccines that the FDA has approved of in the United States, but there are also other vaccines that the FDA has not approved of, but they might do so in the future, and there are some vaccines that other countries are currently using, but the United States isn't. So, as more and more people get vaccinated in the United States and across the planet, we can get closer and closer to herd immunity, and we can get closer and closer to putting an end to this pandemic. In the past few months, the number of COVID 19 cases, new cases per day, has been steadily decreasing, as with the number of deaths due to COVID 19 per day. That has also been decreasing pretty steadily in the past few months. In early January, late December, right when 2021 was beginning, that's when this disease started getting really bad, not only in the United States but also across the planet. I think late December, early January, December and January overall were really bad months for this virus. In these months, the virus infected many, many new people and caused many, many deaths. But I would like to talk about now, since it's been an entire year of this pandemic, where we're at now, and how this virus has progressed over time across the planet. So, I'm mostly going to be focusing on the worldwide numbers in this video, but if there's extra time, I'll also talk about the United States numbers. This is the 1 year anniversary of this being declared a pandemic. After all, pandemic means a disease that spreads across the planet, so that's why I'll mainly focus on the worldwide numbers in this video. So, we're currently at 119 million cases of COVID 19, and this has only been a pandemic for a year, but it's already infected 119 million people, and it has also caused 2.64 million deaths approximately. To be exact, it's 2,641,683 deaths. So that's a pretty alarming number. 2.6 million deaths across the planet. And out of the 119 million people that have gotten COVID 19, so far 94 million of those people have recovered. Now, recovery doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely fine, but it does mean that they did not die from the virus. But what happens is that some people, even if they survive the virus, they do have certain long term effects. Like a lot of people, after they get the virus, even if they recover from it, they still aren't able to taste properly or smell properly for a while longer or even permanently. So just because they have recovered, that doesn't mean they're completely back to normal, as healthy as they were before they got infected. So I just wanted to clear that up. So that also means that there's currently 21 million active COVID-19 cases across the planet. And out of the 97 million cases that have already had an outcome, 94 million of them were recoveries, like I said, but 2.64 million of them were deaths, like I said. So in total, 97.364 million cases of COVID 19 have had an outcome, whether it's recovery or death, and the other 21.74 million of those cases are currently active. Now let's talk about how this virus has progressed across the planet over time. Let's talk about the daily case count and daily death count over time. And then we can also talk about the total case count and death count over time. And then we might also go in a little bit into detail of which countries has handled this virus the worst. So, this virus became a pandemic in March of 2020, like I said, but it really didn't spread that much until later in March, where the first peak happened. So by the end of March, early April, that's when we were getting around 90,000 cases of COVID 19 per day across the planet, 80 to 90,000 cases per day. But it never really went down after that. It mostly stayed stable. And one common theme you're going to see throughout most of this pandemic is that the daily case count never really decreased. It either increased or it stayed stable. And that's pretty unfortunate, the fact that it never really got better up until the past couple of months. In the past couple of months, thankfully, things have gotten better. But after we hit I guess it wouldn't really be a peak since it never really went down from there, but we hit 90,000 cases per day in early April, and it stayed steady up until June of 2020, and that's when the number of COVID 19 cases per day started to increase once again from around 100,000 cases in late May, 100,000 per day, to around 250,000 to 300,000 cases per day by the middle of July 2020. So by mid-July 2020, we were getting 250 to 300,000 cases per day, and once again, it never went down from there. It never really went below 250,000 after that, but it did stay stable for a while. From July through October 2020, the daily case count stayed right around 300,000 per day. So July, August, September, and for most of October, the daily case count stayed at around 300,000, maybe a bit more than that. But then in October of 2020, that's when you once again, for the third time, you saw a substantial increase in the daily case count, and this time it was bigger than the previous two times. That's why I say that the third wave of this virus was by far the worst wave of this pandemic. So the third wave, these three waves, they're mainly things that happen in the United States. The United States experienced three separate surges of this virus, one in the spring, one in the summer, and then one in late fall, early winter. But the thing is that the United States makes up a large proportion of the worldwide case, and that's why the three waves that the United States affected had also affected the worldwide numbers pretty substantially. So throughout October, November, and December, you had a pretty substantial increase in the daily case count from around 350,000 per day in early October to all the way to 700,000 cases per day by the end of 2020, late December, early January 2021. And at its absolute worst, we had around 800,000 cases per day, 750 to 800,000 cases per day in early January 2021. So that's when it was at its absolute worst, both the United States and worldwide. Early January 2021 is when the daily case count was at its absolute worst. But then after early January, that is the first time throughout this entire pandemic where there's been a significant decrease in the daily case count. So after we hit our peak in early January, the daily case count decreased consistently throughout the rest of January, and the daily case count continued to decrease throughout February. So in early January 2021, we were getting around 750,000 new cases of COVID 19 per day, but it went from that to only around 400,000 new cases per day of COVID 19. That's what we're currently at. So throughout the second half of January and February, and I guess the first week of March at this point, the daily case count decreased consistently to get to where we're at now, which is around 400,000 cases per day, which is great news. The fact that it decreased by quite a bit in the last couple of months. But to put things into perspective, the daily case count now is still worse than the daily case count at its worst in the second wave of this pandemic. So in the summer and early fall, that is kind of alarming, but that is just because of the fact that we recently got done with a really bad wave, and also because we're now getting more and more people vaccinated across the planet, I would expect the daily case count to continue to go down in the upcoming months. I don't think we're gonna have another wave of this pandemic that was worse than the fall/winter wave that was really bad. 700,000 cases per day is really bad, but it's good that we're now only at around half of that. Now let's talk about the daily death count. So, just like the daily case count, the daily death count started to increase rapidly in late March, early April, and at its first peak in middle of April 2020, that's when we had around 8,000 deaths per day. But then throughout the first half of May, it decreased to around 5,000 deaths per day, and the daily death count actually stayed pretty stable throughout the months of June, July, August, and September. So just like the daily case count, the daily death count also stayed relatively steady throughout the summer and early fall of 2020. So for several months, it was at around 5,000 deaths per day. But then, because of the third wave, because of the substantial increase in the daily case count throughout late October and November and December and even early January, that is why we also saw a similar increase, a substantial increase in the daily death count throughout those months, throughout November, December, and January. It's worth pointing out that the increase in the daily case count started throughout October, in the middle of October, but because there's a 2 to 3 week lag between an increase in the daily case count and death count, the increase in the daily death count didn't really become noticeable until the first couple of weeks of November. The reason why there's this lag is because you don't, if you're gonna die from the virus, it's not gonna be right after you get it. Like, normally people who die from the virus pass away from it several weeks or a couple weeks at least after they get the virus. It's not like you're gonna get the virus and die the next day. That really doesn't happen generally. But unfortunately, there was a massive increase in the daily death count throughout November and December and even January. But by late January, that's when we hit our peak, and that's when we hit 15,000 deaths per day due to COVID-19 in late January 2021. So that was very unfortunate, the fact that we had that many deaths. But because there was a decrease in the daily case count, a few weeks later there was also a decrease in the daily death count, and that's what we saw throughout February and early March. So it went from 15,000 deaths per day in late January to around 9,000 to 10,000 deaths per day in early March, I guess. So it's gone down by quite a bit, but once again, to put things into perspective, the daily death count now, when we've already dealt with the worst of the third wave, is still worse than the first and second waves at their worst. Like in April 2020, at its worst, we had 7,000 deaths per day, but we're still at 9,000 deaths per day when we're on the recovery end. It's similar to the daily case count, how even now, when we're recovering from the third wave, the daily case count across the planet currently is still worse than the peak in the spring and the peak in the summer. Just to put things into perspective, but we are still recovering nonetheless from the third wave, which I hope will turn out to be the worst wave of this pandemic. I guess now I'll briefly talk about when we hit certain milestones in terms of daily case count, or total case count, and total death count, sorry. So, we hit 1 million cases of COVID 19 in early April 2020. I believe it was actually April 1st, 2020 when the worldwide case count hit 1 million, either March 31st or April 1st, but right when the months were changing from March 2020 to April 2020, that's when we hit 1 million cases. That's also when the daily case count started to increase pretty substantially, as well as the daily death count. And then we hit 2 million cases in the middle of April 2020, and then we hit 3 million cases in late April, 4 million cases in early May, 5 million cases in the middle of May, and then we hit 10 million cases in late June 2020. We hit 15 million cases in the middle of July 2020, and then 20 million cases in early August 2020, and then 25 million cases in late August 2020, 30 million in the middle of September 2020, 40 million in the middle of October 2020, and then 50 million in early November 2020. So notice that from March to November, we went from barely any cases to 50 million. So essentially 15 million cases in around 8 months, but then it's only been 4 months since November 2020, and we've already had 70 million new cases. And that's because the third wave of this pandemic was really bad, and we had many, many new cases per day. So in late November 2020, that's when we hit 60 million, and then 70 million we hit in early December. We reached 80 million in late December 2020, 90 million in early January 2021, 100 million in late January 2021, 110 million in middle of February 2021, and we're about to reach 120 million.